When you think about processes in your company, do you simultaneously get a little nauseous and bored? If even the word process has you checking out, you may want to listen to today's guest. She might change your mind when you realize what it's costing your business. Hi, I'm Beth Fahey, and welcome to Bad Boss Confessional. I've been a leader for over 30 years, and I'll tell you the truth, I've made plenty of mistakes along the way. The thing is, those mistakes taught me more about leadership than any success ever did. This podcast is where we get honest about the moments that we'd rather forget and discover why they're actually the ones worth remembering. Each week, I talk with leaders who aren't afraid to share their worst boss moments and what they learned from them. Because here's what I want you to know. Every great leader has a story that they're not proud of. This is where we tell those stories. I'm so excited to introduce you to today's guest, Lisa Gonzalez. Lisa is a Denver based EOS implementer who also provides virtual sessions. She's the co author of Process, a hands on guide to implementing processes in your company. She's an entrepreneur herself and has developed programs for companies running on EOS to help them get their processes followed by all. I feel lucky to call Lisa a personal friend. Welcome, Lisa.
Hey, good morning. Hello, good to
Morning.
see you.
So, Lisa, we're friends. I know a lot of these things already, but I want to ask some questions for our audience, right? So that they can get to know who you are and just a little bit about your background. So, would you mind sharing with us just a high level overview of your background to date?
So here's my story. I grew up in Southern California in a family of entrepreneurs. My family had 10 different businesses when I was growing up. I literally counted them at some point between my parents and my siblings. And I was definitely the person that would jump in operationally. And so I worked summers for my parents and weekends with my brothers and just helped our businesses really, I don't know, neurotically or just saw the necessity. Either one, the result was I became pretty organized, the filing person, the checklist person, things like that, just to help kind of pull together when you live with a bunch of visionary people. And so fast forward. And so as a result, we had 10 businesses and 4 kids and not a lot of order and a lot of chaos. And to the point where, sometimes like our own businesses would either do super awesome and we were new bikes for everybody, or our house was at risk of being like whatever you call it, turn back to the bank. And so I learned like, the kind of this crazy life of living with entrepreneurs and getting to see a bunch of highs and a bunch of lows and really experiencing like the tension of just what it looks like when you're struggling financially, the tension of my parents' marriage. And so I make a joke sometimes that, in growing up, I ended up like marrying a librarian. But the truth is, I didn't. I took a career. I became a lawyer myself, and I worked with Fortune 500 companies and emerging businesses as well. And then I ended up marrying an entrepreneur myself, and his business was a remodel company. He's very visionary, no construction experience, and his business quickly became another family business. And so I left practicing law and joined him first as the lawyer, and then moved operationally, ran an office, then ultimately moved into, when we learned about EOS, moved into kind of the integrator role for our company.
The people that I bring on this podcast, a lot of them are tied to EOS in some way, but they've all run businesses. So this podcast is for any entrepreneur. They don't have to be running on EOS, but
Absolutely
you
not.
know, there's a
Yeah,
lot of
no.
information about EOS. So that's really what I wanted, is to just create context around your background, because I think what really lands for a lot of people who end up running on EOS or listening to this podcast is that entrepreneurs really don't have a training manual.
And I'd say one of the biggest gifts, especially for your listeners, whether you're running on EOS or not, is one of the biggest gifts we found was we joined EO, which is Entrepreneurial Organization. I'm an EO member now, but it's just it's a peer group that really lets you just be open and honest about what's not working in your business and what is working. Because sometimes, you're worrying about payroll and you talk to a friend or a neighbor that has, a job where they're an employee and they don't even understand what you're talking about. And so those kind of groups I think were pivotal in supporting us throughout the years until and even beyond, like until we learned about EOS. And so we had an office in Denver and it did fine. Like we opened up, we had, maybe 20 something employees, and it was a residential remodel company. And we did well. We actually got a lot of great press. We were great at selling, not great operationally. And so some years we'd have profits, some years we'd break even. It was very up and down for many years, but we did well enough. We kind of just worked hard and we were just still learning as we went, making all the mistakes, but learning as we went. Then we opened an office in Minnesota. My husband has experience. He grew up in the Midwest, and so it felt pretty familiar territory for us. And we took an employee from Colorado who had a ton of knowledge and relocated him to Minnesota with his family. He was awesome. He knew a lot about the business. And again, the same experience where we did well, not amazing, but well enough until we didn't. We had an office, we had a client who everything went wrong with that client. They were very particular, and we were messing up a lot. And so at the end of the day, I had the wonderful opportunity of being like kind of complaint central between both being the lawyer and managing our back office team. And so I did a lot of like what do you call it, like a triaging for that client, where we'd rebuild different parts of his project. We would have meetings. We would send people from Colorado out to help the office as well. And uh, and we ended up, finishing the project well enough. But we ultimately did a debrief of just like what happened, what went wrong, and we call it the RIDDI report, and it actually just calculates the cost of us not having our processes in place, us not having great communication, us not having great expectations set for our trade partners. And we calculated the cost outside of like, rebuilding parts of the project for the client, outside of just the hard cost of sending people from our Denver market over to Minnesota, was about $500,000, money that we did not have. And so we had to take out loans. We had to just like make it work, but we made it work. Having had that experience, this leads to my like not awesome leadership. We decided we were going to open up an office in DC, and then we ended up also opening an office later in Chicago. And along the way, I decided to single-handedly document all of our core processes. And so I didn't tell my leadership team. I did it nights and weekends, and really just gathered what I knew how to do, or and captured those in very, very detailed processes. 100 pages per process, everything short of telling a person how to, turn the handle and walk in the door to start their day. And so, as a result, ended up with this beautiful 3-ring binder that was probably 6 inches thick, and really created just a ton of content that I thought our team would think like this was the most amazing masterpiece ever created. Sometimes I say like, maybe they were going to name a street after me, or a parade, something small. But instead, when I presented it, it completely fell flat, and it was just too detailed. I didn't get buy-in from anybody, which is a big piece I teach today on process. Like, you got to get buy-in from your leadership team first, and then your departments. And it got outdated so quickly, where even to the point I forgot about it. And at first I was really frustrated about it. I was like, why isn't anyone using this, this crazy, masterpiece that I've created? And quickly I realized, because I didn't do this correctly. And so that's like, I think I share this story when I give talks on process. I share it with my teams because there's so many pieces to that as I've matured as a leader, that I understand, where my motivation to make such a decision came from. I think when bosses make bad decisions, a lot of it is driven from fear, and mine was so fear based. I wasn't necessarily doing it to be, I was doing it with the hope that it would help, but it was just fear of losing more money, fear of losing more employees that were just frustrated and getting burned out from having to, kind of fix the fires. Fear, because of our mistakes, our sales would kind of pause because our salespeople didn't feel comfortable selling, knowing that, maybe the product that they promised was not going to be delivered. So many, and just fear of like the impact it made on my financial life, on my personal life. I worked and stressed so much about, whether our homeowners were happy, whether our employees were happy, and it had a cost. And so I think my decision was being driven by fear. And when your decisions are driven by fear, there's rarely a good outcome there.
When I see clients who are over engineering things, Like they're over engineering their rollout, they're over engineering their HR process, they're over engineering, lots of different aspects of their business. It is out of fear.
Yeah, and and there's some levels, like I'm not only am I a recovering lawyer, I'm like a recovering, hopefully, perfectionist as well. And I think all of those lessons, it's definitely stuff that you mentioned at the opening, we don't want to remember these stories. And it took me, a few years ago to remember this story and be like, wow, I learned so much from that. I learned about myself. I have so much compassion today for the leaders that I work with and present to, because I understand where they are coming from. It's like, fear of the same concerns, right? Of losing money in their business, of losing people, losing customers. And it gives me such a perspective today to be like way more compassionate to them than I was to myself, probably than I was to my team, probably to my spouse for sure. And so, because I just know like this is a journey people are on, and the sooner I can actually share these types of lessons and have them not have to go through make the same mistakes. Because obviously today, when we teach process, I was fortunate to co-author the book Process for the EOS Traction Library. It's called Process: How Discipline and Consistency Will Set You and Your Business Free. And it's a pretty fun book, which is seems paradoxical to say when it comes to process, but it's very high level. It's meant to just show you like you don't have to go nuts when you're documenting your processes. It can be very high level. I teach that we are creating, a reference guide when we're documenting our processes more than a training manual. And before I was creating a training manual, it's almost like if I hand you this book lit of, 6-inch 3-ring binder, I could disappear and you would know what to do. And people don't work that way. And leaders, to be a great boss, like you don't do that either, right? You're training, you're growing people, and then they can refer to the processes that you've drafted as a reference guide, reminding them of, oh, they did tell me this thing. Let me go back and find where it's at. And I think that's just so freeing for my teams versus thinking you have to capture every single thing.
Yeah, and I think that's where people get tripped up, right? And it's especially the higher fact finders or the people that are very task oriented think that the magic is in just documenting it. But it's not. I mean, and before I pressed the record button on this podcast, we were sort of talking about this concept, right? That it's really about LMA, leading, managing, holding people accountable to the existing processes. So, like, just to tell a story on myself related to this, because I think like every entrepreneur can relate to this. Uh, I think I had the rock of getting the processes all documented and followed by all because I was the integrator at the time. And so I'm really wired like a visionary with integrator like tendencies, right? So I can get in the weeds enough and so I cranked out these core processes. Like it maybe took me an hour, 2 hours at the most, tops for each one. I'm like, wow, that wasn't very hard. How hard can it be? And then, I'm pretty organized. So I put it in the Google Drive and I'm, organized it by team. We've got sales and marketing, we've got, production team, then we've got logistics, then we've got finance. Okay, great. It's all organized. It's all in the Google Drive. And I made one announcement that all of these wonderful processes were now in the Google Drive. And gosh darn it, we're going to be running on process from now on.
Yeah, done.
Done. But did we ever, when we had a process issue, say, wait, let's go find that process and look at it together as a team and see, are we missing a handoff? Is there something in here that, we're not doing? And instead of doing that, what I did and what I see a lot of my teams do is even following, reading your book and following the process. They create a binder that just sits on a shelf or sits in
The
a
drive,
Google
yeah,
Drive
exactly.
somewhere,
Yeah,
and people just don't use it. And the magic is for leaders to have enough LMA that they say, let's go get it, look at it together, fix it together, get the to dos around the issue of it not being followed, and then, use your level 10 time to actually teach and train on process and make it kind of
exactly.
like a,
Yeah, and so, I've found in like I think 3 or 4 years since the book's been out, that the conversation. So I will be the first to admit that process is the weakest of the 6 key components for the EOS model. It's why we wrote the book. And the biggest stopping point for my teams and teams, I mean, I've spoken to thousands of people about process now, is getting it followed by all. And so I have, a couple of things that I've created and have been really successful for not only my clients, but I help other implementers teach their clients this as well, and or help their clients with it. Is one, we have a boot camp that's just like a just intensive, like let's just learn in 4 or 5 hours how to do all this work. But the biggest piece that I've found success with is I've had like year-long cohorts and cohorts that just let's really talk about LMA. And so how do we get it followed by all? Because plenty of companies have processes documented. If they don't, we can get them started on that. But I really believe that's only 20% of the work. 80% of the work is, how do we use our departmental level 10s to leverage and make them really powerful? And I teach people take 5 or 10 minutes from your IDS time and just train on anything, and then have other people train and just start to grow your leaders. And then how do we attach our processes to our scorecards? It is the only way that I know to keep your processes alive is by measuring your processes. And then the third step of the FBA checklist is manage. And you're exactly right. We talk about how do we drive consequences? Are there consequences if your processes aren't being followed? And I think sometimes teams think consequences means you're just going to fire a person. And there's like 10 things in 10 steps before you fire a person. It's maybe ask a question, why aren't you following it? Maybe like do another training, maybe check in with the whole team, what's working here, what's not working that we need to improve on our process. There's so many steps before you go to, I'm just going to fire a person because they're not following a process. Then the fourth piece is updating. We keep it updated more than just like updating, the document itself, but just taking a clarity break and thinking about the process and thinking about, is there a way we can be more innovative and stay ahead of our competitors? And so there's so much complexity to that. And I think most of the teams I work with are people that are exceptional doers. They were great at doing. I was a great doer. And now they've moved into this leadership role, but they don't necessarily have the tools. And that's why I love speaking with you. I love speaking to teams because it's okay if you don't know how to be a great leader, but listening to podcasts like this, reading How to Be a Great Boss, or doing groups like EO or even my peer group is like, we just have to grow, and being a leader is a journey. And there's always like professional development that's involved, and it never ends. Like I still have so much to learn about being a leader. And so I love being in conversations like this where we just get to help people kind of continue to grow, which is so awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do you see teams getting hung up? And, we teach the 3-step process documenter, right? The first step is identifying the process. So let's take these one by one. Identification.
It starts even before the 3-step process document. It starts at commit. And so I've done a lot of work helping teams understand how to turn process from important to both important and urgent. Because I think often when we talk about process, we talk about, you're going to have more time for, to innovate, you're going to have more time to lead, you're going to have more freedom as a leader. But sometimes we don't talk about the pain that's associated with lack of process. And so on my website, I created like a calculator that helps teams calculate what is the actual quantitative cost for lack of process. And teams reach, $50,000, $100,000. I had a team this week in Dallas that was like, I think it's $1 million a month in their organization. That's probably a $40 million organization due to lack of process. They're manufacturers. And so just due to errors, due to turnover, all those things, they quickly calculate it's probably $1 million a month. And it's not the first time I've heard it. And so these are invisible numbers that are not necessarily showing up as line items on your P&L, but they're definitely showing up it's this leak on your profitability that people don't calculate or don't like embrace. And so one the biggest hangup, I think, before we even get into the tactics, is getting leadership teams to buy into the fact that this is not a nice to have. This is not important, but I'll get to it next quarter, then push it off another quarter. This is urgent. And most companies cannot afford to be burning, tens of thousands of dollars because of this I think it's fairly low hanging fruit to prioritize identifying your processes, then documenting them and getting them packaged. And so in a very short conversation with my leadership teams, we can get buy-in by just having them understand the benefits they would experience with process, the costs of lack of process, and then helping them quantify what is it costing you today. And all of a sudden, this nice to have, or we're going to get to it next quarter, or it's going to be part of our 1 year goal, but we don't really ever hit it, becomes like the real deal. So I love it because it creates this urgency that I haven't before seen teams experience or teams align on in the past.
One of the workshops that we do in one of the quarterlies is 8 cash flow drivers. And a lot of the ahas that happen in the room are, oh my gosh, we're hemorrhaging money here and here, or we could raise our prices, and taking a big step back and seeing where the costs are. And calculating that number is critical to understanding the lack of attention to either your finances, knowing your data, knowing your numbers, but also underneath all of that is process problems
Yeah,
in most
absolutely.
cases.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're not running on EOS, it's the 8 cash flow drivers. You can calculate this. It's, what can you do to increase revenue? And what can you do to reduce expenses to help support cash flow? And so it's, then we pick 8 things, we assign them to an owner, and then we start to tackle them, quarter over quarter. And so it's an exercise that's super, super simple and not easy to execute because it requires you, again, all of this is like talking about working on the business rather than being so stuck in the firefighting of our business where we don't work on the most important things because we're busy, addressing this problem, addressing that problem, addressing this person. And so, yeah, that's a great example, Beth, because it often, if not always, ties to a process issue.
Yeah, process is the one thing that you just watch half the team glaze over in the room when you start talking about it because they're like, oh, it's so boring. It's about doing the same thing all the time. And people that have convinced themselves that they're not process people and I'm a creative, or that's not the best use of my time is like doing process. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how process is everywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. And even to call out my creatives and my visionaries who think that they're not process people. Um, I so we call it, one of the 3 myths, and one of them is like, I'm not a process oriented person. And I just challenge you to see if that's really true. I find that my founders of organizations or my founders of a company or my salespeople, or whoever, like my designers, all the creatives that think they're not process people, they're typically more process oriented than they give themselves credit for because they have figured out, a way to close a deal, a way to generate revenue, a way to keep customers happy, and they realize those things work, and so I'm going to keep doing those things, and the ways to stop doing the things that either don't bring them money or make customers unhappy. And so I think that often my visionary kind of salespeople, designers, founders are so process oriented, they're just so good at it, and they don't give themselves credit for it. And granted, they're not writing things down, but they're definitely like capturing in their brain what works, and they keep replicating it. That's how they were able to grow a business. And it's just when you start to move into, I need to communicate my best practices to somebody else, that we're going to have to find a way to capture it, whether it's, with a video or writing it down. And so I just think the extent to which people think they're not process oriented, it's just not true.
So I'm going to ask you a question. I'm just curious if process ever bites you in the butt a little bit, like to this day, like where you are, oh gosh, I've written a book on this, I teach this stuff, and I'm not following a process.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. A lot of them are personal processes. Like I confess all the time to people, like, follow by all, like it's not like I'm not inclined to do something the same way all the time. And I'm a process oriented person, right? But I also worry, like, is this going to get boring? But the reality is, like, I have to force myself to follow any process until I start to realize its benefits. Simple stuff like I'm taking these vitamins and then all of a sudden I'm feeling fine. So I stop taking a vitamin. Or this year I started working out with a trainer, and I was like, I will never get rid of this trainer because I have to show up and I have to be accountable. And this summer I went away for the summer, and now I'm like finding it really hard to get back in with the trainer. I'm like, oh, I can do it myself, even though it's been like 1 or 2 months since I've worked out. So I find for me, when I stop using a process or a system that's creating habits that are really healthy, I definitely find ways to self sabotage and stop doing it until I feel the pain of it again. I'm like, oh, that's right. Our family has a family meeting. I have 40 examples. Our family has a family meeting every Sunday. We meet and review the calendar. We see what worked, what didn't work. Like, we run a quick family level 10. We stopped doing that. All of a sudden, someone's out of town. My husband's out of town. I didn't realize he was going out of town because we didn't check the calendar. Stuff that I know helps my own, like, mental health and my anxiety. I stopped doing things at work, and then things, go off the rails. And I'm like, oh, let's go back to the process. The cool thing is, whether it's me or your company, when things go off the rails, hopefully sooner rather than later, you're like, oh, we're not using the process. Let's go back to it. So none of this is expecting perfection. It's just reminding you, like, oh, we got to go back to the processes and just keep. I call it resetting the salt shaker. Probably too long to go into the story, but it's a story from Danny Meyer that basically our job as leaders is just keep putting things back in place where they belong. And it's human nature, it's entropy, and we just got to keep bringing ourselves and everyone back to it, and eventually it'll just become our way of doing things.
This is great. Thank you. Because I as the person who we're both kind of like subject matter experts in our world, and um, you know, well, you must be a great boss, and I'm like,
Yeah, exactly.
sometimes I'm not a great boss.
Exactly. No,
Sometimes I'm.
because I'm human, which is we're
Yeah,
just human.
exactly.
So
And again, it's just like, okay, let's come back. We weren't having level 10s all summer. Stuff started happening, and
surprise,
yeah,
surprise. Yep,
yeah,
absolutely. Yep,
there you go.
absolutely.
We'll return to my conversation with Lisa after a word from our sponsors. Do you love running on EOS? Try Strutty, the EOS platform people love. Native integrations and extra features help you manage people, projects, process, and engagement. Connected to your favorite EOS tools and all in one place. You love EOS. It's time to love the platform you're running it on. Try Strutty free at strutty.com. That's STRETY.com. Strutty, the EOS platform people love. Let's be honest, hiring the right people is hard. That's why I love Titus Talent Strategies. Their whole person hiring approach helps you find and keep A players who align with your values, and they back it with an industry leading guarantee. Best part? Titus Talent Strategies is included in the entrepreneurial toolkit for companies running on EOS. Check them out at titustalent.com/EOS. And now back to my conversation with Lisa. Well, let me ask you another question. I ask all my guests this question. So, if you were to get a tattoo that reminds you of the thing you need to work on, and everybody's got a thing, right? Everybody works on something. Maybe yours isn't process anymore, but there's something underneath. And this question is really just to find out a little bit more about you. So, if you got a tattoo, where would it be? And what would it be?
Um, I probably my tattoo would be something like a cross or something like that, just to remind me to be like compassionate and just kind of reflect the just the values that Jesus reflected of just like compassion and no judgment and just stand alongside someone. That would be like the one. Um, if I had like a big giant like arm sleeve, it would say something like, "There's something awesome I bought the other." So it's two different things. One might be something that says progress is greater than perfection, like the greater sign, because I think sometimes we let our perfectionism, and I'm speaking for myself, like get in the way of just get started. Like it's never going to be perfect. Just get started. And another thing I just saw and I just bought was this thing. It's I think it's for HR people, but I literally am going to buy everything about it. And it says, "Did you document it?" Question mark. And that it might say something like that too. So between all the things, you'll see me eventually with tattoos everywhere because I like all the ideas. But at the end of the day, probably just a little simple tiny cross on my wrist,
Yeah,
something like that.
that's great. Beautiful. Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you today. And I'm so glad I got to introduce you to my audience because, I know you and I love you. And it's great to share you and all the good stuff that you're doing in the world. I mean, because I think that this is you're making a dent in the universe in a big way. So
Well, you're so
thank you
kind. So
for
are
your
you. So
contributions.
absolutely. Well, so are you. So yeah, my pleasure. Always great to hang out with you. And if you need anything else, just check me out.
All right. LisaGonzalez.com, right? With
Yeah,
Z's.
all Z's is Lisa, then Gonzalez is all Z's. And yeah, come check out my stuff and tools and downloads and join our community. I really have this like I want a movement around just teaching great doers to become great leaders, and so it's a lot of fun.
You're doing the great work. Thank you.
Thank you, friend. All right,
All right.
thank you.
Talk soon. Many thanks to Lisa Gonzalez for sharing all the nuggets around getting your head around process. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and share with friends who need to hear this. Thanks for listening to Bad Boss Confessional.